Yes, well, welcome everybody. Welcome Deen Freelon. Welcome the audience. Here in Lisbon and online in the cloud and the metaverse apparently. I just want to very quickly. Sorry that I already dropped that word, but I just want to very quickly introduce Deen Freelon, who is an associate professor at the Hussman School of Journalism and Media at UNC Chapel Hill. He's a computational social scientist who has published copious amounts of papers, a lot of it empirical work, but also quite a bit of contributions to what you could say maybe the debate about computational social science, the state of computational social science, and his talk today is going to be about the post-API age, right? Reconsidered. We are definitely going to hear a bit more, I think, about the state of social science. So I don't want to take any more of everyone's time and just hand the floor to you, Dean. I think we'll have some time for questions afterwards, but let's jump right into the talk.
Sure thing. Well, thank you very much, Bernard. I really appreciate that. And thank you everyone for coming. I just want to say as a brief programmatic note, I have a 3-year-old daughter who's home from school today, and she is currently occupied with the iPad, but she may have some needs that I may need to attend to at some point. So please do bear with me if I need to step away for a second and deal with her. The sort of exigencies of childcare are really very much real at this moment. So my talk today is called The Post-API Age Reconsidered, Web Science in the 20s and Beyond. And I'm going to try to give a slightly shorter version of this talk than I usually give due to the aforementioned childcare issues, but I do want to delve into the major issues that we are talking about, or that this talk is typically about. So I'll go ahead and start with that. So the kind of jumping off point for this talk is this paper that I wrote a couple of years ago in a section of the Journal of Political Communication called The Forum, in which they sort of talk about current issues of relevance to political communication and communication research more broadly. And in this paper, I introduced this idea of the post-API age. And typically when you see these kinds of revisited pieces and talks, those are usually like 10 or 15 or 20 years out. But given how quickly time has moved, it seems, or slowly as the case may be, over the last almost 4 years now since this piece has come out, I thought it would be a really nice opportunity to look back at how things have changed in terms of API access to social media data. Let me talk a little bit about what the post-API age is. I sort of see the API age as a time of data plenitude, when it was very easy to access data from social media sources with very limited restrictions or any kinds of issues encountered when trying to obtain that. Whereas we moved over the course of the 2010s decade into the post-API age, in which data is far more difficult to access, and there are far more restrictions and hurdles placed in the way of researchers who would like to access it. And as the image illustrates, the situation is that there is some overlap, right? So there's not a sharp demarcating line between these two. They're overlapping periods. And so the metaphor you can think about here is, if you're familiar with the ideas of the modern age and the postmodern age, there's not a particular point where the modern age stopped and the postmodern age started. They're all it's just sort of a general drift from one state of affairs to another. And I think that's what we're realizing when we're trying to think about how or the options that are available to us in terms of accessing social media data. So let me give you a few milestones of the post-API timeline. And this is, of course, in the 2010s. Some of you who have been doing this work for a while will remember some of these events. So in March 2011, Twitter's terms of service began to restrict public data sharing, making its API the only way to obtain machine-readable data. People don't remember this, but prior to March 2011, Twitter's API did not have any authentication requirements. So anybody could just log in and start pulling data out of the API, and they locked it down. And they also disallowed data sharing in March 2011, which of course was one major hurdle for people to access that data. Let's fast forward over 4 years to April 2015, when Facebook eliminated the search API. So those of you who are familiar with Twitter's search API may not know that Facebook also used to have a very similar search API where you could just put in a search term and pull out all relevant public posts, whether they were from people's timelines or from pages or from groups that match that search term. But they cut that functionality off in April 2015. And so that was something that users, research users were not able to take advantage of after that time. A few months later, in December 2015, you may remember this product Topsy, which is a popular Twitter search engine and data vendor, which has shut down after being purchased by Apple. And so Twitter used to have a sort of data vendor certification program where they basically farmed out their data provision operations to multiple vendors who were able to pass the certification program. They later decided to take all of their data sales in-house via obtaining or purchasing the data vendor GNIP, if you're familiar with that. And so that was a shutdown of sort of the federated system that they had in place prior to that time. In April 2018, and this is the event that really precipitated the publication of the post-API age paper, and that was when Facebook restricted access to its Pages API, which provided post and comment data for public pages. And this, of course, is in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. They realized that that API was a bit of a liability, and they decided to shut it down with some pretty problematic consequences for researchers who were relying on that. In April 2018, that same month, for the same reason, Instagram limited key aspects of its API and sharply rate limited the remaining pieces. And so Facebook was very, very clearly going in the same direction with two of its key products here. So let me just run through a few key points that I talked about in this post-API age paper, now that we have some sense of what came before it and what precipitated it. So I talk a lot about web scraping, which is a tactic that has been suggested as a major research alternative for accessing APIs. It does have the small negative disadvantage that it tends to run against people's various platforms' terms of service. So people should be aware of that in terms of some of the issues that arise from breaking terms of service, including using, or what I suggest rather, is using authorized methods whenever possible. Of course, the whole point of the post-API age is that in many cases it's not possible. Understanding the difference between terms of service compliance and ethical research, which is a topic I think that some of you are perhaps concerned with, or that this conference dealt with. And so the key point there is that simply complying with terms of service does not mean that you're doing ethical research, and doing ethical research can often occur while violating terms of service. And then, of course, understanding the risks of violating terms of service, which may, of course, differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There have been some very helpful and landmark court cases that have really gone the way of researchers here in the United States, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But understanding that what those consequences may be based on where you are is very, very important if you're going to do this kind of work. So let me just continue and extend. This is the post-API timeline as it continues beyond the publication of the paper. And so May 2018, this is right before the paper actually was published, after I was done writing it, the GDPR, with which many of you will be familiar, took effect, which of course explicitly allowed for research-related exceptions to data access and analysis, which is great for all of my European friends. Does not have any effect here in the United States, but for people in Europe, it's really, really great that the GDPR did that. In April 2020, the Washington, D.C. Circuit Court ruled in the case Sandvik v. Barr that violating a website's terms of service does not violate the U.S. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is very, very important. For years, there had been this implication that if you violated terms of service, that could be considered a criminal offense. But that Circuit Court ruling, which is the standing ruling in this situation, is that that is not the case, which is really, really good, which means that researchers won't, be facing jail time just because they happen to scrape something, which is, obviously a good thing. July 2020. So one thing that's really important about Facebook data access is that between the shutdown of the Pages API in April 2018 and July 2020, there were no sanctioned ways of accessing public page and group data before the introduction and the allowance to university researchers of CrowdTangle, which occurred in July 2020. And that's when Facebook began to allow university researchers to apply for CrowdTangle access. CrowdTangle is, of course, Facebook's alternative to the Pages API, which allows for access to most popular page data. One major difference between the Pages API and CrowdTangle is that CrowdTangle does not allow access to comment data, which is very important for some people, but it's better than nothing, and it's also free if you do get access, which is nice. Okay, January 2021. Twitter opens applications to its new academic product track for university-affiliated researcher. This is the biggest development in Twitter data access in almost a decade. And it's something that I played a small part in as a member of Twitter's academic advisory board. This is a product that's really, really great. It provides free access to Twitter data to the tune of 10 million tweets per month, if you don't know about this, for the low, low price of having to submit an application and explain what you're going to do with the data. And so this really eliminates all issues that people formerly had with time limits in terms of accessing Twitter data. And so a really, really nice boon for small and medium-sized projects, for dissertations, and certainly many things that are publishable. So really applaud Twitter for that move. And then in June 2021, the Supreme Court ruled in Van Buren versus USA that the CFAA does not penalize improper uses of data to which a user has authorized access. Now, this particular case was not a research-based case. It was a case of a police officer who accessed license plate data for problematic reasons, but it is widely seen as having implications for researchers and understanding that the CFAA penalizes access and not uses of data to which users already have authorized access. So I want to spend the rest of this talk discussing three specific issues and important issues that follow from this timeline and that are facing web scientists in the 20s, because we are in the 20s. And that the first one is to collaborate with platforms on research or not. The second is the ethics of hacked and leaked data sets. And the third is ethnic, racial, and gender inequities in computational and web science, especially as regarding social media data. So let me talk about platform collaborations. There's really, what really prompts this is the fact that increasing restrictions and complications in terms of accessing social media data have made platform collaborations an attractive option. Now, there's three basic models here. The first is you can apply for API access, you can apply for money and or resources, and then you can have relationship-based data access. And I've done all three of these, so I'm happy to talk about some of the issues that I've run into engaging with these. So applying for API access, this is the model used by CrowdTangle and the Twitter academic product track API. And so basically what you do here is you submit an application in both the case of CrowdTangle and the Twitter academic API. Access is free, but you do have to submit an application. And then you get a pretty wide range of access that you are granted. Both require affiliation with an accredited academic institution, and they also require you to explain your research in some detail. But the vast majority of students that I've sent through this process have been able to get access. And so I think it's a pretty low bar to clear. And it's open to anyone who does have that university or academic affiliation. One thing that's really different about the way these regimes work now is that, if you recall, this was the case both for Facebook's former Pages API, as well as for Twitter's standard data access API, is that you used to be able to submit a form with a very, very basic application that did not include any information about the research you were doing and get instant access to those APIs. Now, the applications are much more work intensive and they require manual review. So rather than just submitting some basic information, getting instant access, somebody on the other end actually has to read it, evaluate it, and then grant you access on that basis. So it usually takes a day or two, and there's no guarantee that you will actually get it. Although most of the folks that I've sent through actually have gotten it. There are arbitrary limits on the types and amounts of data. This is certainly true for both CrowdTangle and the Twitter academic product track. The academic product track allows for 10 million tweets per month. with no rollovers. And there are also limitations on how much data you can extract from CrowdTangle with a single batch export, which makes exporting a large amount of data from CrowdTangle rather difficult. One major advantage that these regimes provide is that once you're granted access, you can generally use the API in a fairly unrestricted way, even though it technically says you should only use it for the project that you have applied for. I don't think they're really checking in most cases. And unless there's some kind of problem, technical issue, they probably wouldn't cut your access off, I'm guessing. But, as is the case with everything I'll discuss today, ultimately these solutions will satisfy some use cases, but not others, just due to the unique nature of each option. So the second model is applying for money and resources. And so these are some of Facebook's RFPs from last year. You can see if I start in the upper left-hand corner, that one focuses on misinformation and polarization. So that's clearly a very social scientific area. The remaining three focus on more technical topics. So moving to the top right, AR, VR smart devices. Below that, agent-based user interaction simulation. And then bottom left, engineering approaches to responsible neural interface design. So they've got a lot of sort of very technical STEM types of RFPs, and occasionally they will throw in a social scientific one that people like me would be able to apply for. And so what this demonstrates is that the RFPs that are released by companies are dictated by the corporate priorities of that company, and not necessarily what is most of interest to academics. But when there is some convergence, people can get some resources and some data if they're successful in terms of applying for those kinds of RFPs. And so one major advantage of this particular model compared to the previous one is that the resources that are on offer are typically much more substantial than what is available via application-based API access. But like most grants and opportunities of this type, there are much more involved grant applications and may entail multiple stages of review. And so this is not just you submit an application, get access 2 days later. It may take weeks or months to hear back first, and there may be multiple levels. Resources, again, as I mentioned earlier, are typically tied to specific priority areas as determined by the company. And of course, this may come as no surprise, maybe rather obvious, but the review process is unlikely to approve projects whose findings may reflect poorly on the company. Obviously, there's no way to quantify this, and no company is going to come right out and say that, but it certainly makes a lot of sense. I think if you look at the projects that have typically been accepted by the companies, you'll see things that have a low probability of reflecting poorly on them, and that's just good corporate sense. And so the third model here is relationship-based collaborations. This is from Facebook's collaborations page. I've got a couple things circled here. For the collaboration requirements, this is sort of the bottom of the page. One major requirement is that a Facebook sponsor must agree to work with the faculty PI to lead the research effort. And then at the very bottom, they sort of have this throwaway line. The best way to explore a potential collaboration with a Facebook researcher is to connect with them one-to-one to discuss a mutually interesting research topic. They make it sound so easy, right? And ultimately, they sort of say this, but they don't really give any help or assistance on how to do that. Obviously, this is a situation in which the platform sponsor is going to hold unequal power in these kinds of research partnerships. As a practical matter, these collaborations won't be open to everyone. There's no way to contact Facebook research staff directly from their contact pages, which seems a little, unusual. And there's no indication as to which research staff are currently open to unsolicited research collaborations. And so as a consequence, these things end up being quite clubby and insiderish, where people who already know somebody or who went to grad school with somebody or have some kind of connection are going to have an inevitable advantage over people who don't have those kinds of connections. Although sometimes non-Facebook researchers are chosen, this is, so I sort of include myself in this because I was selected, were chosen to participate in research partnership as I was. And so I am a member of the Facebook 2020 election research project team. This is public knowledge. My face, but my name is on a page, of 17 other researchers who actually, well, in total it's 17, so 16 other researchers. And so it wasn't an open call. They just, I don't know how they found my name or why they picked me, but they asked me if I wanted to do it. I said yes. We're collaborating with 9 Facebook researchers. The output is 16 pre-registered studies on various aspects of Facebook on the 2020 elections, including the ones that are on the screen. There's more information at the bottom if you want to see who all is involved with that and get a little more information on the project. And so this was not something that I sought out. They came to me. You'll have to ask them why they came to me, why they thought I was a good researcher. I think that everybody on the project has quite a strong research background, and I'm quite honored to be included among them. But not everybody's going to have that kind of option, and obviously I had no control over them, deciding that I was a good person to participate in this particular project. More information about this. Research is ongoing. Academic researchers are not being paid to avoid the appearance of impropriety. Facebook has assured us that they won't suppress any findings that reflect poorly on them. I took them at their word at that. I think they really would upset the academic researchers that are involved in the project if they tried to interfere in that way, which they've not. Non-Facebook personnel are not allowed to analyze the data directly. Rather, we design the research, write the papers, and specify the statistical models, while Facebook researchers actually gather the data and run the models. Some of the machine learning models used to generate the data are proprietary and won't be shared as part of the open science project when the papers are published, and this is just par for the course for working with a corporation. There are certain things they are not willing to disclose, and we all accepted that reality as necessary, as a necessary condition of working with Facebook on this project. So, when you're thinking about either it's the Facebook election research project or anything like it, you want to consider what are the advantages and disadvantages of this particular recruitment model. What kinds of perspective will it systematically include or exclude? And then also think about what kinds of pitfalls that researchers who agree to such a project should look out for. And I'm happy to talk about any of those during Q&A if people have specific questions about that, although I am bound by an NDA, so there are certain things I cannot talk about. So let me move on and talk about the ethics of hacked and leaked data sets. Give a few examples here. There are a number of different types. Some of these you may remember from news reports on them or from having encountered them in your academic work. In 2006, there was an employee leak of 20 million search keywords, which include personalized information from AOL. And so this was profiled heavily in the media when it happened. In 2014, there was a Sony Pictures hack, which was allegedly a state-sponsored hack of private data by North Korea, although North Korea denies involvement. 30,000 plus documents, 170,000 plus emails. There's a really great podcast on this if you want to hear it. Super interesting topic. In 2015, there was the Ashley Madison hack. Ashley Madison is sort of like a social networking site for people who want to instigate extramarital affairs. A hack of private data, obviously quite embarrassing for people involved in this, which included names, passwords, email addresses, and phone numbers. In 2021, there was a scrape of public Parler data, Parler being an alt-tech platform for far-right individuals. Publicly visible content, including posts, videos, images, and geolocation data. I hasten to add that this was a public scrape and not a hack, very different from the Gab hack, which was a hack of private data, which include public and private data, including private messages and passwords. So these are some of the major examples that you may be familiar with in terms of this particular type of data. And so this may go without saying, these kinds of data sets become increasingly attractive when legitimate data is harder to come by. Many data sets address sensitive topics that may bring shame or legal action against affected users. Some data sets provide insights on topics that are difficult or impossible to study otherwise, which are some of the reasons why folks may want to engage with this or not. When I think about weighing the use of these data sets, I think about the multiple research imperatives that these particular data sets bring into conflict. And so there are several factors weighing against an analysis, which include the importance of informed consent, which is impossible to give once the data sets have been leaked or released. The higher burden of justification for analyzing non-public data in cases where non-public data are removed, such as search keywords or geolocation data. And then, of course, there's the possibility of harm for the human subjects that are involved in this. So this is most relevant in the case of people who were involved in the January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol, who used alt-tech platforms like Parler and Gab to talk about the kinds of things that they were going to do. There are several factors weighing in favor of analysis. This is not an exhaustive list. One is the urgency of the topic. If it's a very important topic, you may be able to partially justify your work based on that. The lack of empirical alternatives, which is something else to consider. And then, of course, this last one is one that I really am trying to be provocative in terms of submitting this. I don't think I've seen anybody make this argument, certainly no academic, but there's a notion that embracing certain viewpoints places or may place subjects outside of certain IRB protections. And so I'm thinking especially about January 6th when I talk about this. So the idea that people have engaged with ideas that include, overturning democratically elected governments, and that somehow raises the urgency and makes it so that we don't need to obtain informed consent with them, or we can study them without their, consent. So I just submit that as a question, not taking either side on it, but I think it's something that is certainly coming if it's not here already. Other considerations relate to the nature of the data set and include whether the data set was obtained through patently legal means, the sensitivity of the data, specifically its potential to identify individuals, whether the data include content generated by public figures, and whether the data are publicly available, and what additional damage, if any, research might inflict, right? So you want to think about all of these things because all the cases that I talked about are quite different. And this is definitely something that will need to be adjudicated on a case-by-case basis. So here are some basic tips, and this is, I haven't really done this certainly for publication, nothing more than just my own like individual explorations just for my own knowledge. But if I were to analyze hacked or leaked data sets, I would avoid identifying individuals, especially private ones. This is difficult because of the well-known fact that data sets can be combined to identify individuals in unexpected ways. Really avoid analyzing highly sensitive data such as credit card numbers or passwords. Geodata is a gray area, especially, and that probably depends on whether it was public or private. I would say illegally obtained data such as hacked data presents a high bar against use because you really don't want to encourage that kind of behavior or endorse it. You want to prepare a robust advanced justification for your analysis, whatever it is, using some of the considerations that I outlined on previous slides. And then, of course, as always, seek IRB approval. A researcher's own judgment presents a clear conflict of interest. Obviously, we all want to get our data out there, get our research out there. So, people are going to engage in confirmation bias when they're trying to think of reasons why it's a great idea to use these kinds of data sets, which is why it's really important to include people who are impartial and who have no interests in the research to help design that research so that it can be as ethical as possible. All right, closing in, let me talk about my third of three topics, which is ethnic, racial, and gender inequalities in computational web science. In one sense, web and computational science lacks some of the major barriers that keeps people out of other technical fields. Most of the major programming languages, including R and Python and associated packages, are totally free. Most are cross-platform. You can use Windows, Linux, Mac, whatever you want. Many tutorials and examples are free. Stack Overflow is free. You can go there, ask whatever questions you want. People might not be super nice to you, but in many cases, they actually will answer the question. And so it's really quite wide open in a way that many fields, technical fields, are not. Unfortunately, data science is not a very diverse field. I'm talking about the professional field here, less so, but the academic field, my guess is that it probably isn't that much better. Only 15% of data scientists are women. That percentage is lower at higher levels of career advancement. Women data sets are paid $10,000 lower on average than men. I doubt the situation is much better in Europe. In terms of ethnicity, less than 5% Latino, less than 4% Black, less than 0.5% Indigenous or Native American. And even among tech fields, data science is one of the least diverse. All the data from this come from the link at the bottom. You can check that out for more information. I'm happy to show that again if people want to check that out and take a look. If data were difficult to access and analyze before, they're even more so now, given the post-API age issues I've discussed. These technical difficulties will compound existing structural barriers that keep marginalized groups out of web and data science. But we have an opportunity to build a post-API age that is more diverse and equitable than the previous age if we only have the will to do so. We know that resource availability is not the issue, as I mentioned a couple of slides back. So what is it? So several factors that are at play here. One is the well-known factor of unequal pre-secondary and secondary opportunities in schooling. It's a pipeline issue. People are often not attending schools in which they are prepared to do computational work when they get to college. And so people who have had those opportunities are placed at an unfair advantage relative to those who lack them. There's also a lack of mentorship and representation, which becomes a vicious cycle. People don't go into fields because they don't see people like them, which means there are no mentors, and so the cycle continues. There are also issues of culture or fit, which can be stand-ins for racial or ethnic preferences within companies and research teams. And finally, companies that follow FANG, which is Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, the industry leaders who follow those policies of hiring mainly from a small number of elite universities whose computer scientists contribute disproportionately to the ranks of the Silicon Valley elite. So that being an issue, and the fact that racial minorities and ethnic minorities predominantly do not go, even those who do get computer science degrees don't tend to go to those types of schools. Those kinds of policies are going to underrepresent those sorts of individuals. Why should we care about diversity and equity? If the normative imperative of ensuring adequate web science career prep for all doesn't convince you, there are several other factors to consider. The poor performance of facial recognition tech on darker faces likely has roots in the lack of diversity of the dev teams. This would really, prevent a lot of sort of PR issues and, social media users discovering this after the fact, if they could work on it in-house and get all of that stuff worked out before they actually release the tech. Secondly, observations about the tendency of machine learning algorithms to reproduce structural inequalities often come from marginalized individuals impacted by such inequalities. And again, if they're on the team, they can prevent, all sorts of PR disasters by addressing those kinds of issues on the production and research and dev side rather than after the fact, when the damage is already done. And then of course, there's the well-known business school finding that diverse teams are more innovative than homogeneous ones, which is a long-standing finding in the business school literature, but which many tech firms seem not to have taken to heart. Another question is how relevant web science is to marginalized communities. The past few years have seen an explosion of web science on issues of relevance to marginalized identities. Black Lives Matter is a major example of this. There's also been a lot of research on Me Too and other social movements. However, much of this research, and specifically relevant to Black Lives Matter, has not involved Black people. Now, the argument here is not that only people from a certain group should be able to study themselves, but the lack of representation does create some specific problems, including elevating technical skills above subject matter expertise. I'm sure many of you have had the experience of reading a paper by someone who is highly technical skilled, but has no specific knowledge of the context of the reaching, and it makes for a very interesting reading experience sometimes. There are potential cultural misunderstandings of research design and interpretation that flow from this. So, not understanding things like slang or cultural sort of touchstones that anybody from within that culture would recognize immediately, but outsiders would misinterpret or miss entirely. And also, this sort of non-inclusive data science contributes to the notion that web science is an othering lens. If you've ever heard this term of white gaze, the idea that racial minorities are being placed under a microscope by people who don't really have their best interests at heart. I don't think this is necessarily true of data science, and I think that making it more inclusive really demonstrates the relevance of these methods to people who have historically been excluded from it. So again, these are some of the examples of why I think that web science or data science doesn't necessarily have to be an othering lens. It could be quite relevant to the research interests of the underrepresented. These are all very hot research topics, and all of which very much affect people who haven't really been able to do this work for various reasons. So how do we get there? There are a number of groups dedicated to diversifying tech, including Black Girls Code, Girls Who Code, R Ladies, Pi Ladies, Blacks in Tech. Most of these groups are not academically oriented, and data science grad programs are typically not diverse. The aforementioned barriers make it difficult for underrepresented individuals to gain access to such programs. And then of course, sometimes people who enroll in grad programs and only later discover that web and data science is where they want to go. This has happened to me many times with graduate students in my program who come not necessarily thinking about data science or social media data, but then later on figuring out that's what they want to do. Oftentimes they've advanced to candidacy by that point, and they have to scramble to be able to get and analyze the data that they want to include and incorporate into their dissertation. So here are some initiatives to watch. Twitter has become interested in adding more underrepresented individuals to the data science platform. They've convened an academic advisory board and created an 100-level online course for beginning web scientists, which I think is really great. There's also the Emerging Scholars in Media and Politics, which is not web science focused, it's actually political communication focused, but it could be a good model. Participating senior faculty mentor, promising underrepresented undergrads and MA students to help strengthen their graduate applications. And so, again, I think this is a really good model. I participated in this. The founder is a good friend and colleague of mine. So I think it's a really good model for bringing in people who have not traditionally been represented in web and data science. So just to wrap up really quickly, 2021 is not exactly the barren data wasteland that I predicted in 2018, but data are still harder to access than a decade ago, right? So the party's over, we're through the rabbit hole, we got to figure out how to deal with it. In an age of increasing data restriction and red tape, we need to figure out how to navigate our options while opening our field to those previously excluded. So let me just develop a few 3 points that directly connect with the 3 themes of this talk. When it comes to platform collaborations, proceed with caution, right? Ethics of hacked and leaked data sets, get a second opinion, right? You don't want to be the sole person trying to decide whether this is a good thing to do, and get some advice on how to do it as ethically as possible. Then, of course, when it comes to ethnic, racial, and gender inequities in computational web science, I think I've made my own personal opinions quite clear there. And I think that everybody should really try to do their best in this field to try to make sure that it is as open and inviting as it possibly can be, because that improves the science and it also expands the horizons of the individuals who are so involved. So I'm going to stop there. I think I'm right at about 40 or so minutes. Fortunately, my daughter has not intruded upon us yet. And so I'm happy to take questions at this time if folks have them. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Deen. Thank you.